fact is that
sensible human being who can be trusted. He couldn't be trusted, in Matthew Paris's words, to manage a bank, far less to be president of the United States. So I think one reason that many of us all over the world are very scared is because we've grown accustomed all our lifetimes to taking it for granted that the United States is in the hands of reasonable people, and that is no longer true. And so here we are with this situation created by Donald Trump, where the world economy is being trashed entirely as a result of the initiative, the war of choice started by Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu, also a very dangerous man who's caused untold evil in the world. And we're all very scared about where this goes next, because we are not in the hands of rational, responsible people.
Yeah, well, let's address those issues in due course. But just to answer my question, though, you might be right about all that, but Trump's naval blockade, won't that squeeze Iran's oil output, put pressure on the mullahs, get them to the negotiating table and bow to Trump's demands?
I do not believe that. I think the mullahs do not recognize themselves as either having lost this war or being about to lose this war. I think that they believe that they can tough this one out. I think that they believe that they can last out this whole confrontation longer than the United States and the rest of the world. And given what's happening to the world economy, they could be right. But I'd like to hear what John and for that matter, you, Tom, have to say about this.
Well, Trump does say that the blockade of Iranian ports will persist until a deal is reached. The economic cost to Iran is mounting. Tehran surely knows the US will strike again if it won't come to the bargaining table. John.
Well, I think Max is right that the Iranians can outlast us. The fact is that the international economy is like the Titanic heading toward an iceberg. And we have to shut this war down yesterday so that we don't hit the iceberg. And the Iranians can suffer and withstand this suffering for a long period of time. They have a rich history of withstanding suffering. So it's President Trump who has to come to the bargaining table first. And you want to remember here that the reason we've gone to the naval blockade and we're not going back to bombing is because bombing is not a serious option. And if we actually start bombing Iran once again, the Iranians will retaliate by closing down the Strait of Hormuz completely, closing down the Red Sea, and destroying the 6 GCC countries. This will be an unmitigated disaster. We will definitely hit the iceberg. Furthermore, to take it a step further, we're running out of munitions. The idea that we can just start this war up again and expend all these munitions that are just sitting on the shelf is not a serious argument. We're running out of munitions. This is why President Trump has moved away from the air power option and he's moved to the naval option. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not he can get the Iranians to raise their hands and surrender before we hit the iceberg. And as Max said, and I agree, that's not possible.
Yeah, but Donald Trump and his supporters would say that the naval blockade gives them time. And, the disruption to Iran's seaborne trade, that's surely biting hard. And Iran's central bank told Iran's president that rebuilding the country's war-damaged economy could take more than a decade. Are you and Max downplaying the damage that America and Israel have done to Iran? John?
Well, we did enormous damage to Iran before February 28th with economic sanctions. Iran has been suffering for a long period of time. They suffered greatly during the war against Iraq between 1980 and 1988. They suffered 250,000 casualties. We were backing Iraq. In fact, we gave Iraq chemical weapons to use against the Iranians. And from Iran's point of view, they are facing an existential threat. This is just not a minor war or a limited war. The United States and Israel are out to destroy Iran. They want to wreck the country. And when you're facing an existential threat and you have a nationalistic population, you'll withstand huge amounts of punishment, as we know from what happened in World War I with regard to Japan and Germany. And it's no different here. So the idea that President Trump is going to bring the Iranians to their knees before we hit the iceberg is not a serious argument.
The consensus is that, contrary to Trump's claims, the US is far from winning this war and that Iran has more leverage today than it did before the February 28 US-Israeli strikes. Max, how much damage has this war in Iran done to not just American credibility and prestige and legitimacy and influence, but also American power in the world? Max?
I would say it had done enormous harm. That all of us over the years, and both John and I are of a certain age, and we remember the United States in good times and bad times, and we remember it through Iraq, and we remember it through Vietnam and so on. But underlying everything, for me as an Englishman, and I think for many of America's allies, there's always been a fundamental belief that the Americans were the good guys, and also that the America's word could be trusted, and trust is something enormously important on the world stage. And one of the most important things in foreign policy is to say what you mean and mean what you say. Now, all this under Donald Trump is out of the window, that the word of the United States is no longer trusted, that the United States is feared, that I wrote on a column the other day that it's an extraordinary state of affairs that hundreds of millions of people around the world today go to bed at night fearful about where the world is going, not fearful of what the Russians are going to do to us or what the Chinese are going to do to us, or for that matter, the Iranians, but fearful of what the United States is going to do to us. And never in my lifetime, or I think in John's, have we been in this situation. And it's the terrifying unpredictability of these people who are in charge. Now, what's happening, if you look at the broader geostrategic picture, it's not just this confrontation in the Straits of Hormuz. The cost to Ukraine, that many of us believe that sustaining Ukraine which is the victim of unprovoked aggression by Russia, and which we've all been rooting for Ukraine for the last 4 years of this terrifying war, and terrified for the future of the West, for the future of freedom, if Putin's will prevails. And it is a direct result of what is going on in the Middle East, of Trump's war of choice in the Middle East, that Ukraine is getting more vulnerable by the day, because you mentioned earlier this shortage of munitions. Well, a lot of munitions that ought to be going to Ukraine to hold it up against the latest Russian offensive, that today these munitions are being used up, that Ukraine is in a deeply vulnerable position. And Trump, extraordinarily, he continues to escalate his rhetoric against Ukraine while saying nothing hostile about the Russians. And we in the West, in Europe, we have this deep fear that one indirect consequence, Trump's never liked Ukraine, he's never liked President Zelensky, that Zelensky and Ukraine get thrown overboard because Trump has embarked on, as far as we can gather, at the behest of Bibi Netanyahu, this mad war, which he can't now see a way out of. And I think I should add another dimension. I wrote another column the other day from Bloomberg. Some of us are very nervous that Trump may open up another front by invading Cuba, largely because some of his Sarin advisors are suggesting that he might get an easy win in Cuba, in contrast to the very difficult mess he's got himself into in the Middle East. So it's always this situation. We're all desperate to believe that the world and the West are in the hands of responsible people. And the trouble is, we no longer believe American power, which has been the dominant force for all our lifetimes. And yet today, American power is shriveling because we no longer trust the word of the United States, and we no longer trust what the United States may do next. And I suspect that John, as a good American, may well take the same view.
Well, John, I mean, and we will deal with Russia and Ukraine because I know that both of you disagree on this subject. But John, Max makes the point that US power is shriveling. But then again, the United States, as you well know, paid dearly in blood, treasure, prestige, credibility, legitimacy, all of that during the forever wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. You and I were talking a lot during that period, during the global war on terror in the 2000s. The Bush administration cost America dearly in prestige and credibility. What's so different this time? John?
Well, I think President Trump is sui generis. I think there's no question that the United States did quite a bit of damage to its reputation during the Vietnam War, and it did quite a bit of damage to its reputation and its ability to project power around the world in the Iraq War of 2003. There's no question about that. But this is very different. And the key point you want to remember about President Trump is that he is a unilateralist of the sort we have never seen before. He is sui generis. Virtually every president before Trump thought that international institutions were very important. They thought that international law was very important. In fact, the United States created those institutions, wrote those laws, and thought that those multilateral institutions and the rules that attended them were in America's self-interest. The same thing is true with international law. This is not to say we didn't occasionally violate the rules or the laws, but we thought they were important. President Trump does not think that institutions or international law are useful. In fact, he thinks they're counterproductive. He thinks that laws and institutions are where the Lilliputians tied down Gulliver. So he is dissing all these institutions and international law. Furthermore, virtually every president before Trump believed that it was important to have allies around the world and to treat them with respect. President Trump treats allies worse than he treats adversaries. there's that famous Henry Kissinger quip that there's only one thing worse than being an American adversary, and that's being an ally of the United States. That was not true. That was not true before President Trump. Now, the second big point I want to make, which reinforces that, is that I think that President Trump, once he got into the Iran war and it became clear that we were going to lose the Iran war, began to flail around. That's what you see happening now. And he looks like a mad king. He may be a mad king, as Max is saying, but I'm not sure about that. Regardless, he's acting more or less like a mad king. And when you take his basic unilateralist tendencies before February 28th and you marry that to the situation that he's now in, I mean, he is desperate. This is a devastating defeat for him, and he has no way out. He's not used to this. He thinks he always wins. He thinks he can get himself out of any box that he gets himself into. He can't do that here. And that is making him crazier than ever. And I think this is why we're not only in so much trouble today, but I would argue, Max and Tom, that moving forward, the situation is likely to get worse, not better.
Well, Max, you recently wrote an essay in the Observer newspaper, and the headline, and we'll put this on the screen, "The United States could soon be our enemy." And you go on to make the point that in less than a decade, the American leadership that the West took for granted has collapsed. Now we are forced to consider the previously unthinkable. Max Hastings.
This is what makes us so scared. One of the things I'm very boring about is I keep going back to quoting my hero among historians, the wisest man I've ever known, now dead 6 or 7 years, Professor Sir Michael Howard. And
Oxford University.
Michael was a very close friend of mine. And I remember so many of the things, the words of wisdom that I heard Michael say. And one or two of them spring to mind now. The first he said, and this is probably this conversation of about 6, 7 years ago, well, before he died. He said, we talk too much about peace. He said, peace is not the important word. He said, the important words are order and stability. Order and stability are what matter most to the world. And order and stability are what Donald Trump is knowingly and willfully banishing. He also said, nothing important can ever be achieved without allies and partners. And that relates to what John just said. And it's the willingness, the absolute refusal to consult with or to discuss with. And those of us, John has written many distinguished books, and I've written one or two less distinguished ones. But when I look back, and I wrote a book a few years ago about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I had some fairly weird emails after it was published to my website from Americans who said, how can you speak so well of John F. Kennedy when he treated women so badly? And I responded to them and I said, it may well be true that John F. Kennedy treated women very badly, but he was a man of remarkable wisdom who, when I studied, as we're all able to study through the White House tapes of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the manner in which Kennedy handled himself, this was a man who knew a lot, who thought a lot, and who cared. He cared about the world. He had compassion. He had wisdom. He had all sorts of other qualities, all of which Donald Trump is bereft of. With Trump, everything is about Donald Trump. He is a supreme narcissist. And again, I've said, not only in the column I wrote the other day, but in other columns before this, that, all right, we all know that there's always an element of bullshit when world leaders do talk about their compassion for the sufferings of other people and so on. In the end, there's a huge amount of hard-headed self-calculation. But in the end, also, there has been, at least there's been a pretense of compassion, which has, on the whole, served the world pretty well. And that's now been banished. That Donald Trump and the people around him are telling us all they don't care about what happens to anybody else. They don't care what happens to the Palestinians. They don't care what happens to their allies. They only care about themselves and their MAGA supporters. And one other point I think is very important. I study almost every day the latest American opinion polls. And the last poll I saw, I think today, showed that 37% of Americans still think that the war against Iran is going fine, and they still believe in Donald Trump. Now, I find this a terrifying statistic. All right, that is not a majority of Americans, but the notion that 37% of Americans still think that Donald Trump knows what he's doing, for us who are still to a huge extent dependent on America, they're trashing our economies. There was a statistic in a British newspaper the other day, I think a credible one, showing that Trump's war against Iran is going to cost every British family about $700 or $800. Now, that's quite a lot of money to less well-off British families. And all this has been done by this one man in pursuit of his own ego. And 37% of Americans still think that he's got the right ideas.
But Max, notwithstanding your points about Donald Trump and your earlier point that US power under Trump is shriveling, John, do you see Trump's America as a passing aberration? Or has something fundamentally broken in the American system that won't easily be repaired? John.
Well, Trump himself is a passing aberration because, as I said before, he's sui generis. I've never seen anything like Trump in my life. I find it hard to believe he exists, but he does. He is a truly remarkable politician. That's not a positive or a negative comment. He's in a class all by himself. And if he were to die tomorrow, there's nobody who could replace him, either in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, who looks anything like him. So he is going to pass from the scene. But the fact of the matter is there's a huge amount of disaffection in the United States about the existing political order. And you want to ask yourself, why did Donald Trump get elected to begin with? And why are so many people still supporting him when, as Max points out, they shouldn't be? And by the way, if you look at the mayoral race in New York, where Mamdani, who is a self-declared socialist in the heart of capitalist America, won the mayoral election.
And very anti-Israel.
Very anti-Israel, yes. And New York City has a large Jewish population. But the fact is that lots of New Yorkers are deeply disaffected, just like lots of Americans are deeply disaffected, and they vote for people like Mamdani and Trump. So I don't think this is a passing phenomenon. I think we have so much economic inequality. There's so many people who are really hurting. They can barely put food on the table or a roof over their head. And as long as that continues to be the case, we're in real trouble. I would just note one final point on this. As you know, Tom, I voted for Bernie Sanders in 2016, and I voted for him in 2020, and I wrote him in 2024. I did that because I think that Bernie Sanders understood the fundamental problem that we have in the United States, which is all of this inequality, all these people who are deeply hurting, and he was profoundly committed to fixing that problem. I think Donald Trump is rhetorically committed to fixing that problem, and that's why all of these MAGA people support him. But Trump has done little to fix the problem, and I think if you look carefully at his policies, he's made the situation worse.
Okay, but all those underlying anxieties that you mention about America, John, Max, you're a student of history, and you would be well aware of what's happening in your own country in Britain, across the European continent. Aren't we going through a process across the West where there is hyperpolarization and deep-seated anxieties about the economy and our way of life? It's not just confined to the United States. Max?
I think we see a perfect storm that a number of commentators whom I greatly respect, and I think I'd follow them on this, are very fearful whether in the age of social media which of course has a huge influence, and especially in Truth Social, which is almost the only source of information for many of these Trump supporters. There is this fear whether democracy as we know it can survive in this age of social media, when the traditional media and also the traditional trust for elites has expired. I never forget, I was talking one day to a very smart American ambassador in London one day, and I was talking about my admiration for Dean Acheson, who of course was one of the wise men who, in the post-war era, along with people like George Kennan and Averell Harriman, as you were saying earlier, created the world order as we know it, and played a huge role in promoting the stability and order that those of us who were American allies had cause to value so much. And that ambassador, he said, don't forget that Dean Acheson never won elective office. And the trouble is that these days, which John was implying, I think, that one of the great fears, that 37% I talked about, these MAGA people, they had nothing but contempt for those traditional elites who served the United States, we would say, very well indeed. That they now look to people like Pete Hegseth, who to us is a despicable human being. And also, whereas George Kennan and Dean Acheson and Averell Harriman of that generation, these were men of enormous education and wisdom. They knew a lot. Now, the people now running the United States, they know nothing. They know nothing about the past. They know nothing worth knowing about the present. They know nothing about the culture of Iran, about the culture of the Middle East. And this is what is so scary. And in the past, when I think of all the time I've spent in the United States and also studying the United States, and I've met so many supremely clever and informed Americans, and these clever and informed Americans have now been pushed aside, and they've been supplanted by people like Hegseth, like Donald Trump, who are know-nothings. And yet wield this enormous power. And where I totally agree with John, and I think we have to think very seriously, this isn't just about Donald Trump. We're seeing a sea change in world events and the way that democracies operate. And for instance, I'm always writing for British audiences that I don't think anyone should kid themselves that if we just get through somehow to 2028 without a world war or an economic collapse, then Trump goes and somehow it'll all be all right. I don't buy that at all. I think that this cultural change is very profound, and we have to come to terms with this. And it's no good, where I think John implied, and I totally agree with him, it's no good. Yes, we can say that Trump is a lunatic who behaves completely irresponsibly, but it's sort of no good wringing our hands. He is a fact. He's a very bad fact, but he is a fact. And we have to learn in the rest of the world to live with these new facts and try and work out how we're going to come to terms with them.
John, Max makes the point that and he praises the foreign policy of elites of America in the post-war period. But, I mean, you have argued that the foreign policy elites in Washington in the post-Cold War era and the economic policy elites more broadly, they helped set the scene for the rise of Trump. So what's your response to Max Hastings?
Well, I think there's no question that the elites made a number of mistakes during the unipolar moment. I think that facilitating the rise of China was a remarkably foolish policy because you, in a sense, created a peer competitor. I also think, and I know Max disagrees with me on this, that pushing NATO eastward to include Ukraine was guaranteed to get you into a lot of trouble.
No, I agree with you about that.
I could point to a number of other domestic issues as well as foreign policy issues where I think the elites misbehaved. But if you look at every country over time, you'll always find examples of the elites making boneheaded decisions. The fact is, we live in an incredibly complicated world, and sometimes people do stupid things. It doesn't appear stupid at the time. They think they're doing the right thing. It doesn't turn out that way.
Classic case in point is the best and the brightest in the 1960s in the Kennedy administration, right, John?
Yeah, I think that that's exactly right.
Yeah.
You had a handful of people who were very brilliant in the classroom, but when you put them, in Washington and you gave them the lever, put their hands on the levers of power, they got us into a lot of trouble. But that happens. But the point I would make is Trump is in a very different category than all
Mm.
those people. I think that Trump is dangerous, and I think he's especially dangerous now, as I said, because he's got himself into a losing war and he's desperate. And by the way, he's not only desperate, he's old. As Max and I both know, you don't know this, Tom, but once you get into your late 70s or into your 80s, and remember, Donald Trump will be 80 years old this June 14th. The wheels begin to fall off. You have no control over it. It's
Just
not
some
because
context
Well, you,
here, Donald Trump.
I'm very aware, my dear John,
Because
that
you're the same age as
I'm-
Donald Trump now, Max, 80 years of
I'm
age.
slightly older than Donald Trump. And the one thing I do know is that I'm quite unfit to be president of the United States or indeed to run anything because you see all the things. You see, we all know, you and I guess, are roughly the same age. And we know that our cognitive processes are declining, but Donald Trump refuses to recognize that. And it's the idea. But of course, the other thing that's extraordinary, and we have to face this, is that a number of commentators have written in recent weeks what a disgrace it is that the 25th Amendment is not being invoked to remove Trump from power. But of course, the Democrats started this by acquiescing in Biden's second term
Yeah.
when Biden was manifestly unfit to rule, and how the democracies around the world. I passionately believe. I think one thing we haven't said enough is that we have a duty. Those of us who are old have a duty to those of us who are younger, not just to say, oh God, it's all so awful," but also to try and help to show a way out of this. And I do believe mankind's capacity for renewal and the United States' capacity for renewal is so remarkable. I think on the one hand, it's absolutely right to shout from the rooftops how monstrous what's being done now in the name of the United States is. But I have a passionate faith in the American genius, and I do believe that the American genius may yet revive itself and may yet find a way in the post-Trump era. Yes, many of the forces that have brought Trump to power will still be there, but nobody ever made a buck by giving up on America.
Yeah. John, let's turn to Europe and Russia, because I know there are differences here between you and Max. And of course, Max reflects the views of many Brits and Europeans when he fears this revived Russian empire. Now, the EU nations just this week, John, as you know, approved a $106 billion loan for Ukraine. Now, that's heavily weighted towards military spending, unlike previous European packages. Now, that breakthrough, your critics would say, and I suspect this is Max's line, that breakthrough will surely help Ukraine push back against Russia, which many Europeans and Brits do see as a serious threat to the continent and Britain. John.
Well, there's two issues here. One is whether or not Russia is a serious threat to Europe. And I do not believe that Putin is interested in conquering all of Ukraine. I think he just wants to capture at least the western 1/5 and possibly 30 or 40% of the country. But that would be the eastern part. And I don't think there's any serious chance that he would go into Eastern Europe unless there were trouble in one of the Baltic states involving the Russian population there. But he's not bent on recreating the Soviet Union, and he doesn't have the capability to do that. So I don't see him as a great threat in that regard. My main concern at this point is what's going to happen to Ukraine if you continue to fight this war. I think most Europeans are enthusiastic about seeing Ukraine stay in the fight and continue to stymie the Russians. I don't agree with that because I think that Ukraine has already lost a huge chunk of territory that it cannot get back. And more importantly, I think that Ukraine is in a demographic death spiral. And I think that if they continue to fight, more and more Ukrainians will die, and the future of the country will look even bleaker than it is now. So, my view is whatever the causes of this conflict, given where you are at now, I think it makes eminently good sense to do everything possible to shut the war down and get the best possible deal for Ukraine. And I think the argument that we can give them more money and that will allow them to win in the future in some meaningful way is a flawed argument.
Yeah, Max, won't the European support for Ukraine just prolong the war and more Ukrainians are going to die and the country will be wrecked, as John said? Max.
I can't totally agree with John. I'm sort of half relieved to have found something that John and I don't agree about. But
Go on, push back, Max.
Vladimir Putin is hell bent on ensuring that, in a way, we're sort of back in not quite, of course, Vladimir Putin is not Stalin, but nonetheless, Stalin in 1945 was bent on creating an empire buffer zone around the Soviet Union, and he duly did so in Eastern Europe. Well, in the same way, where Putin's coming from, and I'm not convinced that John is right, that Putin will be satisfied with 30 or 40%. What Putin wants is to ensure that he does not have a Ukraine next door to him that is independent, capitalist, and successful, because it always seems to me that to understand Russia today, one has to start from the principle that Russia is a failure. And Russian bitterness towards all of us is rooted in the fact that we are relatively immensely successful societies and Russia's a failure. Russia cannot build an electric toaster that anybody other than a Russian would care to buy, never mind a car. And all that time, there's this huge Russian resentment to us. And if we allow Ukraine, and I don't agree that Putin will just be satisfied. Putin will want to be pulling the levers in Kiev. And I don't believe that just any particular bit of turf will satisfy. I think it's very important to continue to resist him. Where I have more trouble in being able to argue with John is, do I believe for a moment that if this war goes on, Putin is prepared to keep this game going indefinitely, this bloody game? Whereas, can I say that however much money or however many weapons we give them, the Ukrainians can prevail against Russia? No, I don't. And actually, I think on the right of politics in both the United States and in Europe, at the beginning of this war, there were some hawks, including people I sort of respect, like Laurie Friedman, who kept arguing the Russians were about to fold. Well, I can't say I ever believed that. And my biggest problem in arguing with John, yes, I don't believe, I think it's an enormously important interest that Putin fails in his objective of shutting down Ukraine, of making Ukraine a puppet. And I do think he wants to make Ukraine a puppet. But where I start losing the argument with John is how do we close down this war? And how do we prevent this just going on and on? And I find that a very difficult question to answer.
Okay, John, your response to Max.
Well, I think you have to ask yourself how this war ends if it just goes on and on and on. And what's going to happen to Ukraine is it's going to be destroyed. Its population is, as I said, in a demographic death spiral. And furthermore, you're giving the Russians very powerful incentives to turn Ukraine into a dysfunctional rump state. It used to be that the Russians just wanted to make sure that Ukraine was not a member of NATO. But we've moved beyond that point, and the Russians want to not only make sure that Ukraine is not in NATO, they want it to be a dysfunctional rump state. And this is a disaster for Ukraine. So I think from Ukraine's point of view, we want to end the war. Now, you say, Max, that you think that Putin has grander ambitions. I would just say, look at the quality of his army. This army has been fighting since 2022, and it has had a great deal of difficulty conquering the eastern one-fifth of Ukraine. Does this really look like an army that could conquer all of Ukraine? Especially when you take into account that the western part of Ukraine is filled with ethnic Ukrainians who would resist the Russians mightily. So I don't see Russia as a great threat. I think it's a disaster that Ukraine has lost all this territory that has been wrecked in all sorts of ways, economically, socially, and politically. But that's a done deal now. It's over with. And the question is, how can we minimize the damage to Ukraine moving forward? And what can we do to, in effect, really appease the Russians so that this conflict doesn't start up again?
But
Max, you've said in your recent essay
you,
that the Trump administration brands the EU as the enemy of the United States, and we're clearly seeing a divergence of interest between America and Europe with respect to Russia and Ukraine. But can I just push back and ask you, NATO was created in the late 1940s to contain the Soviet Union. The evil empire, as Ronald Reagan famously put it in 1983, that collapsed 35 years ago. Surely long enough time for America to tell the Europeans who've been bludgeoning off the American taxpayers to get your own defense in order. Max, how would you respond to that criticism?
I've always argued that the one big thing that Donald Trump has been right about for many years is that Europe has been freeloading on the United States on defense. And it's the one issue on which I thought that Trump had an absolutely sound point. And even now, I'm not satisfied that the Europeans, and in particular the British, are doing anything like as much as they should on the defense front. Again, I come back. I find what John's arguments, to me, are sound arguments in the sense that I agree with about 2/3 of them. But when he says the Russians are not a threat, the Russians are wielding enormous disruptive influence all the time, what Putin is trying to do. And Putin is having considerable success in making Russia a serious disruptive force. And I think that Russia is both willing and able to maintain low-level hostilities against Europe in a way that poses enormous difficulties and problems for us, whether it's through cyber attacks, whether it's through attacks on our undersea communications, that I entirely agree that the Russians are not about to invade Yorkshire. But on the other hand, I think that Putin is hell-bent on maintaining at all times. He hates Europe almost as much as Donald Trump hates Europe. And yeah, really. And we have to find ways to defend ourselves against Russian aggression. And I agree with John thus far that I don't think a full-blooded invasion, yes, Russia is not the Soviet Union that was. It's something much smaller. But its disruptive capacity, I believe we have to show much, much greater will to defend ourselves and to do it without the United States.
Yeah, much of the US foreign policy elite, John, as you well know, agrees with Max about Europe, and they're heavily invested in the Persian Gulf. Now, to the extent these trends continue, even after Trump, doesn't that hurt the US pivot to Asia to contain China? Because, John, you have distinguished yourself over the last 25, 30 years as a leading proponent of the argument that China's rise will be a threat to America. It'll be the main peer competitor to the United States. Doesn't everything that Max was saying about Europe and, of course, what we've been discussing in the Persian Gulf hurt America's efforts to pivot to Asia to contain China? John.
Yeah, there's no question about that. Look, there are three areas of the world outside of the Western Hemisphere that the United States considers to be vital strategic interests. One is the Persian Gulf, two is Europe, and three is East Asia. And for the first time in our history, East Asia is the most important area of the world. It was true up until about 2017, I would argue. that Europe was the most important area of the world for the United States. From 1783, when we got our independence, up to 2017, we always had a Europe first policy. That has changed in fundamental ways. The most important area of the world is now East Asia. But of course, Europe still matters and the Gulf still matters. But what's happening here is that we are not able to pivot to Asia the way we should to contain China because of number one, the Ukraine war, but number two, and even more importantly now, the war against Iran. We have a limited number of munitions. We have a limited number of weapons. And the idea that we can fight or be prepared to fight in all three theaters at the same time is simply not true. And we were pivoting to Asia from about 2017 forward. That's when Trump first came to office and adopted a containment policy. But as a result of what is happening in the Iran war, we are pivoting away from Asia. Just very important to understand that. We pulled THAAD missiles and Patriot missiles out of South Korea and Japan. That Marine Expeditionary Unit, the 31st, that's now in the Persian Gulf, was pulled out of Japan. So we're actually pulling forces out of East Asia. We're shifting away from East Asia.
But doesn't this come down in the end to the fact that the United States, or I might have argued in times gone by about whether the global strategy of the United States was right or wrong, but now it doesn't have a strategy. Now it's simply a series of lunges and a series of impulses, and there's no coherence and there's no grip. And the second aspect is agreeing with most of what John says about that East Asia has obviously got to be the most important strategic area for the United States. But the United States, even though this is still the mightiest nation on earth, it needs allies. And as long as it continues to treat allies like shit, then it could find itself in a very lonely situation out there, even in a confrontation with China. Never mind when it's trying to conduct a couple of other wars somewhere else. And I think that Trump is capable of going into Cuba in the next few weeks, just to create yet another diversion. This is not a strategy. The United States needs a strategy, and gosh, actually, the rest of us need a strategy too.
Well, if you're both broadly right here, John, does this mean that this Iran episode essentially marks a watershed moment in modern history?
Well, who knows what a watershed moment in modern history really means? And
well, something like the end of the Cold War with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, something like the September 11 terror attacks, when it had a huge consequential impact on subsequent developments.
Well, if you think about the end of the Cold War, which is in the fall of 1989, and then you think about the collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991, these two events together put an end to the bipolar Cold War, and we moved from bipolarity to unipolarity. And that was a momentous event. That was a world altering event. I don't think that's the kind of situation we're in now. We live in a multipolar world. The United States is still the most powerful state on the planet in terms of raw military power. China's a close second, and Russia is actually a distant third. But those three great powers are out there in the system, and they're not going away. We're going to remain in a multipolar world. And the three conflict areas that we care about, we meaning the United States, the dominant state on the planet, are going to remain East Asia, Europe, and the Gulf. But how we actually project power around the world, how we influence events, how we deal with other countries, I think these are all the points that Max was getting at, has changed fundamentally. How we think about Europe, right, and how we think about the Ukraine war has changed fundamentally. I would note, by the way, people can find this on the internet. On April 15th, a few days ago, Elbridge Colby went to Europe, and he gave a
Senior
talk.
Pentagon official, John. Go on. Yep.
Senior Pentagon official to the different European leaders who are responsible for supporting Ukraine. And he said very clearly that we, the United States, are shifting the burden for defending Europe at the conventional level. And he made clear the conventional level to the Europeans. We're out of here in terms of conventional deterrence in Europe. Furthermore, he said we're clearly shifting the burden for fighting the Ukraine war onto the shoulders of the Europeans. And he said, unsurprisingly, that American weaponry is no longer available in large numbers for Ukraine. So you can see that the Iran war, and Max was getting at this before, has had a fundamental effect on how we deal with Europe and the Ukraine war. And as I was saying a few minutes ago, it's having a fundamental effect on how we deal with East Asia. And furthermore, going back to the Iran war, there's a serious possibility that we're going to have a Great Depression on the planet that looks like the one we had in the 1930s. It looks like we're heading toward the
I
iceberg.
think one note on which, as we come to the end of this conversation, that one thing I'm always complaining about our newspapers about, although they report all the different developments that are going on, whether you're in Ukraine, whether in Iran, and so on, I feel it's terribly important to keep telling readers and keep telling electorates worldwide, let us be clear that what is going on around us at the moment is probably the most important and in many ways the scariest things that have happened since 1945, with the most significant impact on the world, on the West, and so on. And we should be treating these issues with the gravity that they demand. And one of the fundamental things that seems to some of us scariest is that our national leaders, in many ways, are not responding to these huge events, to this huge, colossal instability, with the sort of gravity that I would have thought these events demand. But what does John think?
I agree completely. I mean, we talked about President Trump at the start of the show, and there's no question that he's not up for the task. I mean, if you think about the three big crises that the United States has faced in its history, number one being the American Civil War in the 19th century, number two being World War II, and number three being the Cuban Missile Crisis, which you were talking about before, Max. I think we were blessed, and I think that's a good word, we were blessed with exceptionally good leaders in all three of those crises. Abraham Lincoln, of course, in the Civil War, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who I think was a brilliant military strategist in his own right, as Nigel Hamilton has laid out in his 3-volume study of Roosevelt as a commander in World War II, and then Kennedy, as you were describing, in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we escaped from all three of those crises in actually very good shape because we had terrific leadership. And I don't think that we have terrific leadership in the crisis that we are now in. And this is a deadly serious crisis. I agree with you on that, Max. We are in real trouble, and I am not feeling good about having Donald Trump at the helm.
Well, let's try to cheer ourselves up. The breaking news during this broadcast, President Trump has announced a 3-week extension of a ceasefire with Iran. That's surely good news, isn't it, Max? Cheer us up.
I think we have to hope that at some point Trump realizes he's lost this war and quits. I'm not totally sure. One has to remember in the background, I mean, I'm afraid I'm also pretty scared of Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, that Netanyahu is pursuing his own agenda into which he's dragged Donald Trump. Netanyahu is a completely ruthless man, overwhelmingly preoccupied with trying to keep himself in power and also trying to achieve a degree of dominance over the 5 million hapless Palestinians who he is determined to see bow the knee to Israel. I think this combination, you have people who cannot be trusted to get us out of this responsibly. But I think, to put it in the simplest terms, the best thing that could happen now is for Trump or those around him to realize they are not going to get a win down there, and they just better try and find a way out on almost any terms.
And John, I should stress that ceasefire that President Trump announced was between Israel and Lebanon. But will Israel go along with that for 3 weeks?
I think the greatest threat moving forward is actually Israel, and let me explain what I mean by that. It's very clear from what's happened in this war that Israel has been unable to eliminate Iran's nuclear enrichment capability with conventional weapons. And it's clear that Iran is going to maintain a nuclear enrichment capability, which means that it can build the bomb relatively easily. And in the years ahead, there is going to come a time, I believe, where the Israelis conclude that this is an intolerable situation, and they have to eliminate Iran's capability to enrich uranium up to weapons grade level. And given that they cannot do that conventionally, I think the temptation for Israel to use nuclear weapons will be very great. And I would not put it past the Israelis to use nuclear weapons. So I think even if President Trump is able to shut down this war, he's going to be forced to allow Iran to have some kind of nuclear enrichment capability. And that's going to open the door for the Israelis to countenance in serious ways using nuclear weapons to solve the problem.
Israel and nuclear weapons. Final thoughts, Max? I'm afraid I think there's a lot in what John says. And one reason, another, to go back to my dear friend Michael Howard, I remember Michael saying about 25 years ago, he said the one thing worse than Iran having nuclear weapons is for the West to go to war to stop them having nuclear weapons. And I also remember being told 30 years ago by both the American and the British military that there was no way of conclusively shutting down the Iranian nuclear program using conventional weapons. And one reason that some of us always thought, and successive United States presidents refused to support Israel's prime ministers in attacking Iran, was precisely because all the military advice has been consistent for 30 years. You cannot shut down this nuclear program with conventional weapons. Now, I hope John is wrong, but I think he is flagging a very serious threat, and the degree to which Donald Trump has licensed the Israelis to do terrible things, terrible things, which have done enormous damage to the long-term interests of Israel and its reputation in the world, is one of the scariest aspects of this crisis. So I'm back agreeing with John 100% on that.
Well, look, as depressing as this exchange has been, can I just say it's been a thrill and honor for me, and I speak for our audience, both our